We are continuing with our sessions, and the next session, as I indicated, is a panel discussion on the political economy of social protection and the future of work. And on the panel, we have Dr. Verena from Mauritius. She'll be joining us virtually. Dr. Verena is an associate professor in economics at the University of Mauritius. Her research is on social protection, gender, labor market, and international trade. And I will ask that you read her full bio in the program. It's there. Then we also have Mr. Musema Gweli from Rwanda. He's an assistant lecturer, subject coordinator of entrepreneurship at University of Rwanda College of Education. Then we have Mr. Chuma. Is it Kumani or Chumani? Kumani. Mr. Chumani Makwele from South Africa. He's a master's candidate at University of Cape Town, and his research explores the political implications of the hashtag Rhodes Must Fall student movement on colonial and apartheid signs and symbols in democratic South Africa. He will be co-presenting with Miss Courtney Halling from South Africa, who is a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Cambridge. She previously completed her master's at the University of Cape Town. Then our last presenter is Dr. Hangala Siachiwena from Zambia. He's a postdoctoral researcher in social policy and based at University of Cape Town Institute of Democracy. His research interests include social protection, social policy, public policy, and the politics of development and elections and democracy. So in that order, I'm going to ask our presenters. They will each have 8 minutes. And those that are doing a joint presentation, it still remains 8 minutes. So you'll have 8 minutes to do your presentation, and we'll get into a question and answer session. We have our timekeeper. Please let's adhere to his instructions in terms of timekeeping. So over to you. Is Dr. Verena online? If you could confirm.
Yes, I'm here, Chair. I'm already online. Can you hear me? Am I audible?
Are we connected to Dr. Verena? We are. Thank you so much. So Dr. Verena, over to you. I hope you heard the instructions. You have 8 minutes, and we will have a question and answer session thereafter. So over to you. We're looking forward to your presentation, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Chair. I hope you can hear me. And thanks to SASPEN for having me for this conference and for being able to present my paper. So my paper is on supporting the world of work via social protection measures to meet the SDGs, and I'll be talking about the case of Mauritius in the midst of COVID-19. Next slide, please. So I would set the, can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So I would set the background, the objective of the study, the data and methodology which has been used, findings and policy recommendations. So we can move to the next slide, please. Beyond a health crisis, we all know that COVID-19 has been a human crisis. It has been having many socioeconomic impacts, and especially on the labor market. And we've talked about that earlier this morning, where it's been affecting vulnerable populations, especially in terms of loss of jobs, less working hours, loss of household income, people moving to informal jobs, etc. So it is very important to protect the rights of workers, creating decent jobs and working conditions. And these are important for the new 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And in fact, going towards decent job, it's very important and highlighted in SDG 8, promoting sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth, giving opportunities for full and productive employment and decent work for all. Next slide, please. So we will be talking more about the social protection measures in Mauritius and looking at the situation of vulnerable population in the midst of COVID-19 and see the measures which government have been implementing as a result of the pandemic, whether these have effectively reduced the vulnerability of workers in Mauritius. Next slide, please. So we will be looking at the social protection system as in many other countries. It's rather wide in Mauritius, ranging from free education at all levels, from pre-primary to tertiary levels, free health services, free transport for students and elderly, and a panoply of social aid schemes. And we've seen that over the years, government has been spending a lot on social security and welfare. And as a percentage of total government expenditure, this figure has reached around 28.5% in the financial year 2019 to 2020, but it's definitely higher now because at that point it was June 2020, so the recent figure is likely to be much higher. And as a percentage of GDP, it reached around 9.4% and is expected to be more than that. Next slide, please. So when we look at that situation, we look at the data, we said that without government transfers and poverty rate would have been much higher. In fact, without universal basic pension and social aid benefits, it would have been much higher. And in fact, the current poverty rate stands at 9.6%. If we do some kind of simulation, we'll see that without all these, the poverty rate would have been at around 34%. And without government transfers, any of them, it would have been 23%. Without free health, free education, and free transport, it would have been around 21%. So these are very important, especially for the vulnerable segments of the population and also those on highly vulnerable we've seen with COVID-19. Next slide, please. So when we look at the situation of COVID-19 in Mauritius, in fact, we had the first wave around March 2020, and then we had a second wave around March 2021. The first wave, we had a lockdown of 3 months, and then after that, Mauritius was COVID safe till February 2021. But we've seen that the number of cases since then has been rising, and as May 2022, we've seen a number of cases going up. But what's made Mauritius different as well compared to other African countries is the high death rate. And the problem with Mauritius is that we have a high aging population as well as high level of comorbidities. Of course, there could be underreporting in the figures for other African countries, but even for Mauritius, we had some kind of underreporting also. So can we move to the next slide, please? So if we look at the figures, we've seen that for Mauritius, we have like a high level of vaccination rate going on compared to other countries. Even Seychelles, it's much higher. But still, the fatality rate from COVID-19 has been on the high side recently after the second wave. Next slide, please. So what we will be looking at is with that context of COVID-19, there has been a number of social measures being in place, and two important ones related directly to the labor market was the wage assistance scheme and the self-employment assistance scheme. The wage assistance scheme was targeted to businesses in the private sector, mainly those operating in the tourism sector. As you know, Mauritius is an important tourist destination, and the tourism sector has been highly hit. Also the manufacturing sector and small and medium enterprises. This measure was to prevent companies from laying off workers. And the other one was the self-employed assistance scheme, mainly to assist self-employed persons who've been extensively affected by COVID-19 in terms of loss of revenue. So these were the main two measures which were there to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on the population. Next slide, please. So in this case, we've been using the survey data, the Rapid Continuous Multipurpose Household Survey, and it was phone interviews being conducted by the Statistical Office with household members to look at their livelihoods, what are the coping strategies as well. And we can see from the data, next slide, please, when we look at the data, we could see that the total number of people with income less than 7,509 rupees has been increasing. In fact, this is the relative poverty, and we've seen that it's not only increasing, but women tend to be most affected. We've seen a higher number of women facing being in the low income category, and in fact, feminization of poverty is also a reality in Mauritius. Next slide, please. We've also seen that there has been a fall in household income. Within the pandemic, people have been facing a fall in their income during that period. After the lockdown, it's like during the lockdown it increased. Then after the lockdown, when there were less restrictions, people could move to other activities. There were less health containment measures. But we can also see from that figure that the percentage of women facing a fall in household income has increased, and compared to men, it's still increasing even as at December 2020. Next slide, please. So we also look at these whether these households have been facing other problems like food security. They could not have access to, they didn't have enough money or resources to get food. They could skip a meal or even go without food a whole day. And we've seen from the data that if we split that in terms of employment status, we see that those vulnerable workers, mainly own account workers, apprentice, contributing family workers, were most likely to be affected, right? They went without food, and also women as well also face similar situation. The percentage increase in terms of those who face food issues. Next slide, please. So they had difficulties in meeting expenses during that period. Though after the lockdown, it seems like it was a bit better, but then you still have a high percentage of people facing difficulties in meeting the expenses. Next slide, please. So we've seen how vulnerable they are, and as a result, what causes that was, of course, the pandemic being here. And even despite the measures that were there by the authorities, we could see that still there were layoffs. People lost their job despite the wage assistance scheme. In fact, many firms reported that it was not sustainable for them to keep their workers, and they have to reduce their workforce. And the figures speak for that. And we could see that 21% of individuals were either working less, and 20% encountered a fall in income, and around 14% just stopped working due to the pandemic. There was a rise in the number of women working as own account workers, vulnerable jobs, a rise in the number of men and women, both of them, as contributing family workers. So those moving to jobs, but what kind of jobs? Vulnerable jobs. And there were also people who've lost their job during that period. And after that, it was difficult for them to get into the labor market. Next slide, please. So we've talked about unemployment, like there has been a rise in female unemployment, male unemployment as well. And we've seen the rise in total number of people being unemployed. But at the same time, when we look at the figures, we will see that it's essentially young people who've been most affected, those aged between 16 and 29. In fact, Mauritius already have a problem of youth unemployment, and this has been accentuated with the pandemic. Next slide, please. So vulnerable jobs, loss in jobs, but also a movement towards informal work, which makes them more vulnerable in terms of social protection measures, and also then making their livelihoods more difficult. And we've seen that men and women are also there in the informal sector, as well as young people. Next slide, please. Okay, so what we can say that the policies which were there, emergency policies, just to mitigate the impact of the pandemic, on vulnerable segments of the population, they were mainly short-term and temporary, I would say. And in fact, of course, we talk about sustainability and long-term measures. It's the wage assistance scheme and the self-employment assistance scheme have been helpful to some extent to reduce that vulnerability initially. But for those who've lost their jobs and they are very vulnerable to poverty. So we believe that labor regulation is key of any social protection system. Weak labor regulation causes the labor markets to function unequally, putting the most vulnerable workers at a disadvantage. So there is an urgent need for greater coordination between social inclusion policies, especially in the domain of social protection and labor inclusion policies. These are fundamental. How can you help companies to retain the workers? Maybe there are other policies like reskilling, integrate them to other sectors of activities. So in a sense, just not to reduce the workforce so that job losses, because job losses have important implications on the livelihoods of vulnerable groups. So thank you. I hope I have been in the right time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, very much sticking to time. So in the interest of time, I'm going to invite the next presenter. Verena, please stay online so that you take questions at the end. And those that have questions, please just note them and we'll present these at the end of the session. And a kind reminder to keep our masks on unless you're speaking. So everybody, please let's remember to adhere to the COVID regulations. So I'm going to invite Mr. Is it Focus? Focus.
Yes, I am.
Online. Thank you so much. We can hear you. Please go ahead. You have 8 minutes. And if I find you are going over the time, I'll just remind you that you are at 2 minutes. I'll remind you.
Thank you very much. I will not be necessarily scotched on the slides, so I must be faster than because I have so many slides. So when I say next, don't hesitate to cope with me. Thank you. Yeah, my presentation first shows the Rwanda map with the you see radio posts. This is one of the actions that have been done during the COVID-19 period to distribute radios to poor families to be able to follow lessons for their children to follow lessons in a remote area, which means something within the social protection and related to COVID. The next slide, please. Is a landlocked country. It means what it means. It means that not access to ocean. Then when we have the idea of countries within with which we are bordered, it gives also the idea when it comes to compare social protection policies within those countries. Next slide. Yeah, population, density, demography, see, more than 500 people per square kilometers. It gives what it means. Then there is a shortage of arable land. You understand how the agriculture suffers while it's the main activities. And they don't lack access to the Indian I have talked about. The fertility is around 4 births per woman, which influences just the demography. Then the life expectancy, 69. The growth rate is there. And the GDP per capita, 820. I think this information gives the picture of how next, when we will be in the next slides, the situation is. This is a definition: all private and public income transfer schemes, social care services, livelihood support, insurance schemes that together ensure that all extremely poor and vulnerable people have income, security, a dignified standard of living, and are protected against life cycle and livelihood risks with a view to achieving sustainable graduation and self-resilience. This is the understanding behind the Rwanda National Social Protection Policy from 2020. We will see now what have been made and so far what can be done. Next, please. The main pillars of the social protection in Rwanda, we have social security, short-term social assistance, social care services, and the livelihood and employment support, which are based on 4 principles: protective principles, promotive principles, preventive principles, and transformative principles. Next, please. Yeah, this is just the draw to show how those pillars are interconnected. I have talked about them. I think we can go to next. Yeah, this is also a kind of interconnection of those principles from the pillars. This is what I have also talked about. We can continue. Yes, the economy now, the GDP has been increased by 11.1. Industrial production, as you see, has expanded by 16.5. Agriculture output rose to 6.8 in the same year. Traditional exports in Rwanda, we have coffee, tea, wolfram, so have increased by 25% in the first 9 months, 2021. The employment rate remained more than unemployment rate remained more than 15 percentage points above levels of the beginning of 2020, with the female employment deteriorating at the rate of 13.6%. And the National Bank of Rwanda maintained the policy at 4.5% over the past 20 months. And the COVID-related spending equaled 2.6% of the GDP in 2020-21. Then the recovery also increased tax revenues, and the fiscal deficit narrowed by 0.4% of the GDP. The deficit was primarily financed by foreign borrowing, although domestic debt financing amounted to 0.9%. Yeah, economically, this will show us the influence with the good. We have conducted a survey from which we have just taken the most of this information. We sampled the 2072 informal workers within 25 different job categories located in urban areas, semi-urban, semi-rural areas, and in rural areas in the different districts of Rwanda, from 4 provinces of Rwanda. And there you see within each district and within each province the number of the respondents we have talked with. Next, please. Yeah, Rwanda has made commitment to ensure social protection, the effective social protection with various partners, including international, UN and ILO and the other international organizations. Next, with also there are some commitments announced in the national legal or policies. This is the next slide. You see how it has been committing to, yes, national policy framework within the constitution, the vision 2020, vision 2050, national policy, all those are texts that within which it's clearly highlighted how Rwanda is committed to ensure social protection for all. Now, these are the main programs within which the government intervenes to support the mobilization and integration persons. Those are ancient militaries who support genocide survivors from the genocide against Tutsi 1994 survivors. Nutrition, including ECD, childhood development, refugees and emergency assistance, and the district provided social protection. Then vision Umurenje programs, those are programs within we find more vulnerable persons in Rwanda. And you see how the billions have been used to each category, where VUP Umurenje, Vision Umurenje program has been is the one which has used the most budget. District provided social protection. As you see figures. We will come perhaps to comments next. Next, please.
1 minute to
Next
go.
slide. Oh, okay. So if it's 1 minute, the employment situation is not favorable to vulnerable. Then also budgets allocated sometimes are not favorable. Then within COVID, the situation has been aggravated, and measures that have been taken called upon for the government to look after those who are more vulnerable, but the situation could not, of course, allow this as people were in lockdown. That initiatives that have been taken has improved a bit. So to conclude, perhaps there will be the way forward. Let me to that one. There is a need to focus on food security and to think about to revisit the policies of social protection, to have a strong network between all stakeholders and the partners, and then to put the citizens who are beneficiaries at the central, especially the most vulnerable should be the target. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being responsive to the time factor. You will have an opportunity to respond to questions. So we'll come to our presenters who are in the room with us, and we'll start with Mr. Kumani from South Africa, and you are co-presenting. So we'll hand over the time to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. I think there was a bit of a mistake. My colleague, Courtney from Canada, University of Cambridge, she will start the presentation. We will work together on the paper, and then I will take after her.
Awesome.
Please go ahead.
Awesome, thank you. Is this working? Yeah. Okay, cool. Okay, so the title of our paper is ANC Disowns Promises of Economic Emancipation in the Age of COVID-19, examining individuals' experiences of the social relief. Pardon? Okay, is it working now? Yeah, okay, cool. So examining individuals' experiences of the social relief of distress grant. Next slide, please. Okay, yeah, I can stand. That's fine. I'm just gonna stand here. Is this one on?
Yeah.
Okay, then I'm just gonna use this one. Okay, cool. So the aims of our paper is first to better understand individuals' experiences with applying for and receiving the COVID-19 grant. And I'm not going to go into the details too much of the grant, just in the interest of time, but it was introduced shortly after the pandemic started. It's 350 Rand to unemployed individuals. And the second kind of aim of our project is to better understand the livelihoods of unemployed people in South Africa. And we're kind of trying to challenge this enthusiasm around the introduction of the COVID-19 grant, particularly because the people who are receiving this grant have been unemployed for years. Their circumstances really haven't changed with the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're kind of interested in understanding what about this pandemic has kind of enabled the final introduction of unemployment assistance in South Africa. And then finally, we're trying to situate the case of the COVID-19 grant in South Africa's transition out of apartheid and promises of economic emancipation that haven't yet been realized. Next slide, please. So this is a new project. We're kind of just starting, and we've begun interviews in Cape Town in 3 locations. So 2 are in Woodstock. One is referred to as Douglas Square. The second is Sissy Ghoul House, which is a community that has occupied the old Woodstock Hospital. And then finally, District 6. Next slide. So we used a kind of mixed sampling, both purposive and convenience. So we chose these locations because they, the people living there occupy a really interesting kind of intersection between debates on land, particularly land that people have been forcibly removed from, and then also economic emancipation. So the individuals we were speaking to are people who have deliberately chosen to occupy land that they or their ancestors had previously been removed from. And as I said, this project is just starting, so we haven't spoken to too many people yet, but we plan to continue speaking to people throughout South Africa. And one challenge we faced was individuals not feeling comfortable disclosing whether or not they received the COVID-19 grant. So we ended up speaking to more people who actually weren't able to get the grant. Next slide. Okay, I'll let you take over.
Thanks very much. I suppose we have to pay some form of respect. There has been some violence that have been taking place in South Africa, just briefly, that are led by Operation Tudula. And one Zimbabwean was killed and some few South Africans. I think if we are serious about what we are doing, we'll then be able to link what's happening outside in relation to social grant, social services, unemployment, and so on and so forth. But I think if we touch that, because I think our scholarship must speak directly to the people, and the people must respond to that scholarship. Otherwise, we are just playing games of ideas. But I think what we're trying to do here is really to depict and go on the ground as opposed to desktop. Go on the ground, how our people are living. I'm sure across South Africa, but if you zoom in Cape Town, you will see, I mean, in our slide there, I don't think it shows properly, but there's a young lady, ordinary, like you and me. Somehow they're forced by circumstances to go and live in an open land in District 6. They're living there, they're occupying the land. And then if you ask yourself, why would someone like that be living in those conditions? I can tell you now it's not COVID. That's what I was trying to say earlier on. This thing in South Africa has been happening for a very long time. Therefore, COVID exacerbated this problem. And then, of course, when COVID arrives, I mean, these statutory measures of the state and government, in order to get the COVID grant, you must have an ID, you must have a cell phone number, you must have been registered. All these categories, these normal people with eyes, legs, arms, and so on, they don't have these things because they're living on the street. Therefore, those who are actually meant to get this program, they're not getting it. That's the reality of the matter. If you don't have ID, you don't get a social grant. If you don't have a cell phone, you can't register. If you don't have a home, you are sleeping on the street, you have no internet, it's done. Therefore, we are saying that there's a misnomer here in relation to government. Therefore, the policy is not responding to the problem. In fact, if you are serious to analyze and critically study the problem, you would realize that if you have a cell phone, if you have internet, if you've got a home, you might argue that, in fact, you don't need the 350 grant. Because those 3 things represent someone else in a structure in economic society, right? But our government says, no, if you have cell phone, you have internet, you have a home, okay, get it. But we argue that in fact, you don't qualify. Someone who's supposed to get this money is living on the street in Khayelitsha. If you walk around Joburg, I'm sure when you were traveling, you saw people who are carrying recycling material. Those people can't get the money because they don't have internet, they don't have a cell phone. Next slide, please. you then get the same response. For me, I mean, if you can see the picture, this was beautiful because what strikes me, that's why I was talking about history, responding to the professor, that it's important to talk about history. These people, they've occupied what's so-called the prime land in Cape Town in District 6, next to Cape University, PenCAC, University of Technology in Cape Town. South Africa spent 2 years and spent billions of rands arguing about land, whether to expropriate land or not. And that policy proposition failed. It didn't happen. Meaning, whatever was happening is as if it did not happen. But these people jumped the whole 2-year process, which was a wastage. They went and live in the land. They're living there now, but they cannot get the social services that are meant for them. They're occupying the land. This is, for me, it's very revolutionary. What my colleague was showing, there's 2 occupations in Woodstock as well as in Waterfront by ordinary people. Government building they've occupied. Ordinary people, they can, actually, that's why I was saying that if we are honest here, I was interested, it's just that we didn't introduce ourselves here so that you know who's here. Because when we're listening to these people who have occupied, well articulated in relation to their problem, they know what's happening, they know what is wrong, they know why they are there. But yet, the so-called policy experts, gurus of social services, gurus of social protection are here. The people who are affected by social services and challenges are not here. I think this is the problem. And this problem has been happening over 10 years or more in the scholarship. And I'm saying, I think we must think twice about our scholarship and how we respond to that. Next slide, please. But you then find in our slides, because we want the voice of the people to come out, we cite what people are saying about these services and the challenges that they are confronted with in relation to SASSA. Because sometimes if you look in government officials, I think they are misplaced in terms of their thinking, their programs. They're not touched with the people on the ground. And I think as scholars who are critically involved with this thing, we must be able to assist. But somehow, of course, you get some people who will be so ashamed to speak this truth because they want to funders to be happy, colleagues to be happy, and so on and so forth. I think if we do that kind of a game, we are dishonest to ourselves. We must be truthful to scholarship. Scholarship must respond to the people, not only those who've got PhDs and master's degrees and so on and so forth. It must respond to the people, so that the people, the only way the scholarship, we can see that the scholarship is responding to the people must come on board, so that we don't quote them, they assert their own assertion as to what is happening in their communities. Therefore, these are the citations that are coming from there. I mean, in Sisukul, for example, there's a community leader there, well articulated, former activist during apartheid, but is living there. And it would be great if he was here so that he can articulate his own views and speak to his own truth. But I suppose what we are trying to do in the conclusion is to really lament the point that I was making earlier on, that in fact, people who are in need of the COVID are not getting, for the very reason that I've outlined, cell phone, ID numbers, and so on. Millions of South Africans and foreign nationals in Johannesburg as we live in. That's why I was talking about one of the Africans who were killed from Zimbabwe. And some of the people here would just think that it's xenophobia, Afrophobia, without divulging what is the cause of the problem that is affecting people on the street. In fact, I would argue that South Africans have been killing each other since 1994 in this country. That's actually 2 days ago or 3 days ago in Khayelitsha. If you read newspapers in South Africa, 7 people were shot in Khayelitsha. And the week before that, 5 or so. Now, it is not a phenomenon of Afrophobia or xenophobia. Of course, there's an element of that. But I'm saying South African poor people have been killing each other. What do we do about that? What is the reason about that? It's poverty, inequality, and so on. That's why I was saying we must be honest to history. And the history of this country is that what Professor Talbrand, whom I really think his book on the history of the economic history of South Africa speak truth to power. Because Sarchi says that Black people in this country were forced into free labor. And the results of that is what we see today. The violence, the unemployment. For over 300 years, Black people could not participate in the economic reproduction of their own lives. Their land were taken away from them, they were killed, and so on and so forth. And then today, we are sitting here in comfortable hotels, thinking that we will talk about what we see as if it's unemployment. No, it's a historical question of land. It's a historical question of injustice, killing of Black people by white people in this country. And of course, that's why I'm saying we as scholars, critically thinking, we must avoid to be dictated to by policy gurus or government officials. Now we are forced to discuss about constant constellation. Should we extend it? Should we not extend it? Why ANC government is struggling to say we will give our people social grant so that they have a social protection? Because they're unemployed. And the reason why they're unemployed, the apartheid government and the colonial government made the point that a Black person could not become what white people are today in this country. Owners of industries, owners of their own lives in terms of professionals. I myself am a product of social grant through my grandmother. As I'm standing here, I survived in the rural Eastern Cape because of my grandmother was getting an old age grant. My mom could not work because she was married, and you would understand that social structure. My father died in the mines, was working in the mines. Now, if you understand the history of the mines, therefore, that my father worked for free for the rest of his life because of the mine gurus and because of white people, they were controlling those mines. Therefore, I'm saying, for me, it is important to attach real lives in these stories, not just academic, nonsensical kind of masturbation of ourselves. No, real lives, what other people are saying on the ground. Therefore, I'm saying that the disconnection between the government and policymakers and unemployed people is what I'm talking about. Bring the people on board, make their own policies, make their own challenges that they are confronted with. And again, the last point are historical views on poverty. Bessie Head, in one of the, I'm living, Bessie Head in the forward to one of the renewed book by one of the public intellectuals in South Africa, Sol Plaatje, The Native Life in South Africa. Bessie Head says, South Africans have got a disconnection of sense of history, a lack of sense of history. Because Sol Plaatje told us a severe story of being Black in South Africa in 1912, when 1913 came on board, and then he says Black South Africans became pariahs in their own land. And that statement is what we're experiencing today. Black people in South Africa today, by far the majority, are still pariahs in their own land. Therefore, I'm saying it is our responsibility as Black scholars. That's why I was saying we must be careful who is articulating the scholarship, who is writing about these social policies, who is talking about these social policies, so that we can be able to answer the question of those who are outside, the excluded, the marginalized, the erased. The last point, Professor Colonel West, when he came here to address the Mandela celebration, he says, I'm not here to celebrate the Mandela question, celebrate with him, but I'm here to question and interrogate. Therefore, I'm following in the footsteps of Professor Colonel West to say, look, I'm here really to make some people angry, uncomfortable in raising these issues. Because when we leave here this as the same as we came in, then we'll have failed our responsibility and our task. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I think one of the reasons we get together every year for this SASPEN conference is so that we can interrogate, we can have candid conversations. So we'll continue with the discussion. Allow me at this point to invite our last presenter for this panel, who is Dr. Hangala from Zambia. And I will ask that you also take 8 minutes. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm looking at the interaction between COVID-19, elections, and social protection in Zambia. I'm mainly looking at one, how did the government react to the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic? How did the international donor community deal with the economic impact of the pandemic? And what would account for why the government and the donor community differed in their approach? And finally, what can we learn from that going forward? Can move on. We can move on. Briefly, the government took an approach that they called life and livelihood. And by that, they meant they did not want to shut down the economy completely due to the fact that human livelihood would be affected. But on the other hand, they needed to protect human well-being and health. And that meant they had to find a way of combining both looking after the health of people and looking after the economy, meaning they adopted a broad approach that involved having a budget for funding the health intervention to combat COVID, but they pumped in quite a bit of money too to ensure that they kept the economy going by paying money to people who were crucial to managing the economy, particularly people who were involved in road construction work, which had been a major area of the economy under the then Patriotic Front government. We can move on. But more importantly, the government implemented a 480 million kwacha empowerment fund, which mainly targeted the informal urban economy. Now, you may be aware that 9 out of every 10, or roughly about 9 out of 10 people in employment are employed in the informal economy, primarily market trading, rural agriculture, and therefore the government had to find a way of making sure that that category of people were taken care of. And empowerment funding included giving them a loan that they could repay at a time when they were economically viable. In the picture there, I show actually the head of state, Edgar Lungu, at the time, giving out a check to a beneficiary of the empowerment fund. We can move on. But if you've noted from what I have talked about until now, you don't really hear much of any, cash grant payment being paid like we've heard from people who've talked earlier. We can move on. So the international donor community, primarily, the World Food Program, UNDP, Plan International, to mention a few, collaborated with the government to implement a COVID emergency cash grant program. Now, the implementation of the program, the government handled the implementation of the program through the Department of Community Development, but the actual funding for the program came from the collaborative effort of the international donor community. And the approach that they took included, one, identifying people who were already benefiting from the regular cash grant program, and then two, trying to identify other vulnerable people, particularly people who met the criteria to benefit from the regular program, but were not benefiting from it. They were then added to the program, and that whole program amounted to about 480 million kwacha, of which, like I indicated, the funding did not come from the government, but it came from the international community. We can move on. There I show a map of the parts of the country that were mainly affected by COVID, which then needed to benefit from that COVID cash grant. Can move on. Why would the government prefer to allow the international donor community to meet the funding for the COVID cash grant program? Keep in mind that around 2014, the then government at the time, the Patriotic Front government, took primary ownership of funding the regular cash grant program. Now, if they had taken ownership of funding the regular cash grant program, what would motivate an approach in which they preferred to allow the cooperating partner to carry the weight of the funding. And what I'm going to refer to now, or what I'm going to talk about now, will be very helpful in thinking about Yeah. From around 2015, the country had been going through major economic decline. And part of that decline, and I won't go into the detail of what led to the economic decline, but the government had been indebted over a period of time. And if you look at the graph on the left, on my left, the national debt had grown from under about $1 billion in 2010 to over 11 billion by the end of 2019. And in addition to that, GDP growth had been declining rapidly over a period of time, including in 2019, the year before the COVID-19 pandemic hit. We can move on. One major implication of the economic decline meant that the government had limited revenue to fund the national budget, meaning they would have a national budget in which they indicate what they are planning to do, but the amount of money that would actually be paid out to implement the budget did not match what had been budgeted for. And looking at the regular cash transfer program, if you look at the year 2019, and I won't go through every year, but in the year 2019, the government had a budget of about $1 billion in order to fund beneficiaries, of which budget 700 million should have been government funded and the remainder donor funded. But in that particular year, the government could only afford to fund 93 million, meaning that if you look at what they had committed to funding and what they actually managed to fund, that left a very huge gap, which then meant donor involvement had to become relevant in order to meet the shortfall. Can move on. But more importantly, the COVID-19 pandemic hit about a year and a half before an election that many people knew would be a competitive election. Now, why did that matter? Well, in any election campaign, the main contender in the election campaign are fully aware of which target group within the population they want to target with a particular program in order to win popular power. And the urban informal economy have been very crucial, or were very crucial, to the vote for the then ruling party. And the rural agricultural economy are equally very important, or a very large voting bloc. In short, at any given point in time, a regular cash grant program will be competing for attention with empowerment funding programs targeted at the urban economy, and even a farm input program targeted at the rural agriculture economy. So we can move on. And here, if you look at the national budget for the year 2021, which had been published in 2020, the year before the election, funding for the farm input program went up fivefold at a time when there had actually been more funding going to the cash transfer program, and an attempt to redirect funding from the farm input program to the regular cash grant program in order to ensure that people who were poorer, the orphan, the vulnerable children, the aged, who should have been better targeted by the cash grant program, were now competing with the rural agriculture economy. I think we should go to the final slide now. So in short, what can we learn from what I've shared up to now? Move on. The point that I made about the decline in the economy showed why if we want to manage, if we want to have a meaningful social protection framework, that can only happen in an environment of a well-performing economy. And therefore, we need to begin to question where would the money come from to fund the interventions that we talk about here, if the government cannot even, if they are not managing to grow their economy or to maintain a well-performing economy. But other than that, I mentioned earlier that the government had a shortfall in funding the cash grant program, meaning that there were many people who were going over a year without actually getting their monthly grant. Now, if people who are already poor are going over a year without getting their monthly grant, then what would the impact of that be on them? I think at the moment we may not have clear information, but I think that would be an area that we probably need to get more involved in. I think even the media can play a role in highlighting the impact on people on the ground. I think people in academia can play a role in conducting more research and finding out more information. But finally, the fact that the urban informal economy and rural agriculture are clearly very important at election time, they clearly should not be forgotten when we begin to think about intervention for social protection. Now, I know that the ILO have been doing work in that regard, but clearly there's more room needed to begin to think about how people working the markets, people who are vending, there's more room to begin to think about how can they be better targeted, whether through health insurance, funeral cover, old age pensions, or any other kind of intervention that even people in formal employment are entitled to. Thank you very much, and I end there.
Thank you so much to our presenters. Lessons from Mauritius, from Rwanda, from South Africa, from Zambia, I think all just showing the increased vulnerability of various populations as a result of COVID-19, but also the opportunities that exist for improving social protection provisions in our continent. We are desperately out of time. We are very much behind time. So I will allow about 10 minutes of conversations with our presenters and those our presenters online. Please be alert. There will be some questions coming through. Please come up front and just tell us your name and speak to the mic so that those that are online can also hear you. So I recognize 1, 2. Any other hand? Okay. So over to you. Sorry.
Great, thank you so much. My name is Christina van Straten. So my comment is mainly to Mr. Chumani, and then also to the research done by Courtney, I think it is. So I really value the work that you do, and I think that all of us in this room can affirm the fact that there's the most valuable in our communities often lack access to the very policies and programs that are meant to support them and help them. My comment, and I'm going to be careful with how I say it because Mr. Chumani is sitting next to me, but my comment is that we need to not bite the hand that feeds us. And so in a sense, I think every single person in this room has committed their lives to social protection. And I think most of them can echo the sentiments that that's not a path you choose for money or for fame and success and that kind of thing. It's something you pursue because you have a calling to pursue the well-being of your people, the most vulnerable people in your society. And so I would say that, yes, the social relief of distress grant has its failures. It definitely needs to be expanded. I'm highly in favor of the basic income grant. But I think that the social relief of distress grant would never have been implemented without particularly some of the minds in this room, the social protection experts that fought for that against Treasury, against government, the support of the Department of Social Development for the social relief of distress grant. in the green paper, etc. So I think my point is that we need to bind together, and I understand that we cannot represent the marginalized and the poor and pretend that we have gone through what they've gone through. I'm a privileged white girl. I have never struggled in my life. Completely acknowledge that. But I think that we have the responsibility to use our privilege to fight for the social protection of the most vulnerable. And so that's just a comment that I have.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
My name is Richard Rory. To the panelists, well done. I have two comments. One goes to my friend from Mauritius, the issue on decent work. Now, during COVID-19, nobody cared about decent work. It was about life and livelihoods, putting food on the table. But you know what COVID-19 did, of all things, is that it mainstreamed social protection as a key strategy to poverty reduction. And probably what we need to think about before Chumani gets very angry is to question ourselves about the politics of social protection and social justice. Because the issue of, and now you begin looking at it in terms of the levels, right from the governance, the leadership, to the technocrats. Each of us, Chimani, we have all sinned.
It's time to repent.
We have all failed, including the academicians, including my good professor. We keep on writing papers, we come here, we get angry, so what? We need to go back to SDG Goal 1, Target 1.3, and the issue of leave no one behind. It's all about inclusivity. Now, where did the rain start beating us? Why? How did it happen that the people with a phone, the people that have a house, are the ones that were being given the money? Very simple. We don't have data. So when we were hit and we panicked, everybody was screaming, people were going on the streets, we are dying, government must take action, but take action on who? So if we have got to address this, one thing that we must do is to promote inclusivity. We must create in all our countries a social registry so that we know who is poor, who is not poor, who has what, so that in the event of such a crisis, then we know whom to target. I submit.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that submission. I don't see any other hands. So I'm going to hand over to our presenters. In 1 minute, we received comments, not questions per se. So in 1 minute, I will ask you that you give your final remarks, given the comments that we have had, possibly some reflections that you might have, having listened to your other co-panelists. So I will start with Sir from Zambia, Doc from Zambia. Yes, I think. So if you just stand close by, so because this will be very fast. So if you give us your concluding statement.
Yeah, I think in conclusion, I will agree with Jumani that we should think about how we define the poor, and that there should be more, we need more data to actually identify who the poor are and to make sure that we are targeting the correct people. Failure to which the wrong people might, people who are better off might actually be benefiting from what we are trying to do. Yeah.
Thank you. Over to you. I don't know who's going to give. Yes.
Okay, sure. I'll go first. You can also say something. Yeah, I just want to respond to Christina's comment, or a part of it at least. I think maybe we just need to clarify that we're not calling out the people in DSD and SASA who have done the incredible work to get this grant through, and civil society organizations, etc. It's the people who have been fighting this grant for decades, and in Treasury, etc. And I think also there's a difference between biting the hand that feeds you and holding kind of people in power accountable, and that's what we're trying to do. Yeah, but I'll let you.
Yeah. All right.
Now you have 30 seconds.
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks very much. I suppose, I think I take the comment seriously from my colleague, and I think in South Africa particular, as Black people, I think we've got a responsibility to offend white people, right? Because in South Africa, I think for too long, white people are too comfortable. And Rhodes Must Fall showed that, Fees Must Fall showed that, Open Stellenbosch showed that, right? Just a story. There's an institute in Stellenbosch. It has been led by white people for long. They just appointed a Black African 2 years back. This semester, they've got fellows that they bring fellows all over. This semester, that institute is full of white people from Europe. Only 2 Africans. One is based in US from Cameroon. One is from Zimbabwe. When I'm saying this story, when I said I confronted him on a public platform, he was so angry, and I said, that's what I wanted to do. And then the following day we met, he said, Tumani, please, sometimes just come direct to me and tell me what is the problem. I said, no, you knew the problem. You were sitting there. How can you call fellows all over who are white because their funders are coming from Switzerland and so on, and they call their friend to go and sit in Stellenbosch, when there's Africans here who wants to explain their scholarship and share. As a result, even you can go now to the institute in Stellenbosch, they cannot tell what is the problem because they're all in Europe. Why they didn't go to Harvard and sit there alone? Why did they come here? Now, I think we must indeed bite the hand that feeds us. Otherwise, we will sell out. This statement is the same statement that the ANC government can make. The reason why the ANC government is so scared to make the social protection a permanent feature is because it's scared of white handlers. Whether in IMF, World Bank, or the white capitalists here in South Africa, they are too scared, right? Now, what then do is that because of, they will then promise the poorest of the poor, no, we extended your social grant, your child grant, and all that stuff, vote for us. We must depart as scholars, at least. We must depart from that kind of thing that don't bite the hand that feeds you. If you don't want to invite me next year or you don't accept my paper, that's fine. As long as I've spoken the truth and I'm engaging honestly with you, because that's what we have to do. I agree with you, sir, that indeed we must intensify the question of access. I can tell you, most of us as Black people, as soon as we get to the university, we get scholarship, we keep quiet because we don't want to offend people. As soon as we get a job in the private sector, in government, we keep quiet because we don't want to offend people. I think that's a wrong approach because those who recruited us, they end up getting a wrong message because we were supposed to come here and represent the truth about the people. I come from the rural areas. I will be failing those people who are in the rural areas if I cannot offend you here and make you uncomfortable here because they have no access here. That is why I must be honest with you so that when you plan again, that's why I gave a feedback, so that when you plan again, don't bring scholars only. Bring social activists, bring people from the rural areas and in communities so that they can speak for themselves. That's why it's important for me that we can be able to that. Decent work, it has been an old struggle that we must continue to fight for as scholars as well as the communities. Otherwise, our scholarship will not have impact in community. And now I can see that my scholarship is having impact because people are starting to get uncomfortable. That's what we want so that we can go forward. And I think maybe later on, we'll have a coffee session, those who are interested, so that we can discuss these things honestly, and particularly young scholars here. I hope that program director, maybe in the next session, we will introduce ourselves, because I don't know who's here. I'm interested people to introduce themselves so that I know I can assess the environment in the room. Thank you very much.
Assess the environment in the room.